Wonderful. Daniel chapter 8. The vision of the ram and the goat. What is amazing is the details that we find in this chapter about the second and the third world kingdoms that succeeded Babylon, the silver and the bronze, which correspond, of course, with Daniel chapter 2, and, of course, with Daniel chapter 7, corresponding the bear and the leopard kingdom. To me, the most revealing of the whole of Daniel chapter 8 is especially if you can see there the two verses that actually brings everything together. Would you guess what two verses is the most important in Daniel chapter 8 to understand the chapter? Who of you know? Remember, if we talk about Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, we do have corresponding kingdoms all the time. But when we go to Daniel chapter 8, the focus is not on the Babylonian or really on the Roman Empire or even the revived Roman Empire, although later in Daniel chapter 8. But the focus in Daniel chapter 8 is to bring these two kingdoms into focus. Why? Because out of these kingdoms, somewhere you will find out that somebody will arise that has the same characteristics as the Antichrist in the last days. So what actually happening is they're narrowing down the appearance eventually of the Antichrist. Because when you go to Daniel chapter 9, chapter 10, and chapter 11, it narrows down to actually where it comes from. So all the time, every chapter now, we get closer and closer and closer to the last king of all the Gentile nations, the Antichrist. So what we actually are seeing here, you see all these kingdoms, but what Daniel chapter 8 does, it narrows the vision and focus on the Medes and the Persians and the Grecian Empire. So the two verses that actually give the story away is verse 20 and 21. Can we read it? The ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings of Media and Persia. Did you see it? There's your answer. It is about the ram and the goat. And now clearly, later on in the chapter, he says, the ram which you saw having the two horns, they are the kings. So, here you can see the ram that comes with the two horns, but there's the big one that broke off. But the ram that you saw are the kings of Media and Persia, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king, which we know would be Alexander the Great. So these two verses actually tells us that the ram and the goat represents two kingdoms. Medo-Persia fight against Greece, the Grecian Empire. That's what it's all about. And the reason why it's in our Bible, when you get later on in the chapter, you find that there's the law of double referencing. In other words, although we are talking about somebody that will come in the near future in history, it transcends to somebody that will come at the end of the days to the earth. God is using it to symbolize and explain something very interesting to us. All right. So let's read verse 1 and verse 2. Daniel chapter 8. In the 3rd year of King Belshazzar's reign, I, Daniel, had a vision. Now, this is a vision of Daniel himself. After the one that had already appeared to me, which one was that? Think now. In Daniel 8, Daniel says, I had a vision after the one I had on an earlier stage. Which one was that? Daniel 7. And what was the one in Daniel 7? he saw in Daniel 7 the lion, the bear, the leopard, and the terrible beast. So what he says is, after this vision that I saw earlier, I now had this new vision, and now I see something different. Where previously he saw a lion, a bear, a leopard, and the terrible beast. Now God is telling him, I want you, Daniel, to give you more detail. Don't look at the bear, the lion, and the leopard, and the beast. Look now, there's a goat, and there's a ram. And so now things change because it gives more detail that you couldn't find there. So God is giving more detail. And God explains. The explanation of the angel is clear. They are the kings of Media and Persia, and the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. So when you read about these animals now, as I'm reading with you, please understand, we're looking at kingdoms. What is going to happen to Gentile kingdoms, and how is it going to touch the land of Israel, the Jews? All right. So let's read. I had a vision after the one I had already appeared to me, because this one is in the 3rd year of King Belshazzar. You will remember the vision of the 4 beasts was in the 1st year. Daniel 7 verse 1. In other words, what Daniel is saying, 2 years later in my life, in my old age, I had again a vision. 2 years after the vision of the 4 beasts, I had another vision. And the vision I had is about the goat, and yes, it is about 2 animals, a ram and a goat that fight with each other. In my vision, I saw myself in the citadel of Susa, which is a fortress in the province of Elam. That, of course, is Iran. In the vision, I was beside the Ulai River. So what is interesting, which you didn't notice, in your Bible, as I start reading verse 1 and 2, the language changed. We are back to Hebrew now. Remember that from chapter 2 to chapter 7, the language changed to Aramaic, and now it changed back to Hebrew. And of course, there's a reason for that, because we are now in direct reference to what's going to happen to the Jews, to Jerusalem, the sanctuary, the temple, the coming Antichrist, the defilement of the Jewish temple in the last days. So clearly, because Israel is now at stake and the well-being of God's people, the language will go back to their language, which is the Hebrew language. And the vision that he saw, which was 2 years before, this one covers only 2 empires. The Persian and the Medes and the Grecian. Now, the stronger one, you will see that the bear, the one foot was up in the air and the other on the ground, because the one kingdom was stronger. The kingdom that was the strongest between the Persians and the Medes was the Persian kingdom. And of course, they had a king, and we will have a look at him just now, because it's very interesting who this king was and what he did. But as for now, the vision that Daniel had, he was transported, could be at night or day. The Lord take him in a vision away to the land of Persia in Elam and by the river, and which is north of the Persian Gulf. And we know it would later on become a province of the Persian Empire. And Daniel saw himself standing there next to the river. And in his vision, standing there by the river, in other words, the Lord takes him to where the kingdoms is going to fight and where things is going to happen. And what is that? The struggle between the ram and the goat. Remember, if I talk about the ram, every time I say ram, I talk about the Medo-Persian Empire. I talk about the arms and the chest of silver. If I say ram, this is what I'm talking about. You understand? The moment we use the word goat, we are talking about the bronze or the leopard kingdom. So what you have now is 2 animals But not a bear and a leopard anymore. What we now have, we have a ram and we have a goat. He said in verse 3 and 4, I looked up, and there before me was a ram with 2 horns, standing beside the river, and the horns were long. Of course, the ram should have 2 horns, because it's going to be the Medes and the Persians. It speaks for itself. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. I watched the ram as he charged towards the west, north, and south. It's very interesting. Not to the east. Why not? Why do you think he would charge to the west, the north, and the south? Because the ram is coming from the east. So it tells you what kingdom it is. It comes from the east. And is pushing towards the west, the north, and the south. No animal could stand against him, and none could rescue from his power. He did as he pleased and became great. Well, we know, because the verse says, verse 20, the ram with the 2 horns are the kings of the Media and Persia. So we know that the ram of the 2 horns represents the kings of the Medes and the Persians, which we call the Medo-Persian kingdom. The fact that the one horn was above the other, of course, because one part of the kingdom was stronger, more dominant than the others. That the ram charged toward the west, the north, and the south. You must always, when you read in the prophecies of the Bible, wherever you are in the Bible with prophecies, if I say to you, north, north from where? From Israel. If I say south, south from where? South from Israel. If I say east, east from Israel. If I say west, west of Israel. So Israel is always in the center. So from Israel, if he would push to the north, it will mean Syria, Turkey, and those countries is involved now. Iraq and Turkey and Persia, to Turkey, that area is now, of course, at stake. If I say push to the west, it will mean he will go either to North Africa or to southern Europe. And if I say he goes to the south, it includes the Arabic Peninsula and many of these countries going down to the south. And so it shows us the expansion of the Persian Empire. So all we see in this vision, God shows him how this kingdom, the leopard kingdom, but now symbolized by the goat, by the ram, how it expands the kingdom, how it's going to grow. In other words, all we're looking at the very moment is how Gentile nations is going to play out in the future. It is a prophecy of the wars to come and what's going to happen in the future. God is revealing it to Daniel. The east is not mentioned because the empire started from the east, of course. And Cyrus was called and appointed by God. Now, we know that more than 100 years before he was born, some scholars had it even 200 years before he was born, his name was mentioned in the Bible, that one day this Gentile king will take care of God's people. And he was. He told them to take all the belongings of the temple, go back to their country, and they did, under this king. So he was very good to God's people. And you can see the prophecies in Isaiah 44 as well as Isaiah 45. You can go and read that in your own good time. And he was instrumental. And in the book of Ezra, in your Bible, you will see how he went at great length to say, God has put it in my hand, because they actually read from the scriptures in the Bible, the Old Testament, to King Cyrus. And when he read his name in the scriptures, more than 100 years before he was born, and he says, God has even put my name in the Hebrew scriptures, I will be the one to send them back to their country. He was very happy to do that. So God, in a miraculous way, prepared the way for his people to go back to their country after 70 years of exile in Babylon. by using this king, because he overpowered. You must remember that this kingdom overpowered this kingdom, and Israel was under this kingdom. And when he took over, he became the strong one, Persian, Cyrus, and he's the one to say to the Jews, go back to your nation. Go and build your temple. And even there would others follow after him, Artastarchus and others, that say, go and build your walls. Go and build your city again. It was a wonderful thing how God has prepared all of this. And we know from history in Ezra chapter 2 that approximately 50,000, there was 3 moves back to the land of Israel, and the first one we had over 50,000 people under the leadership of Zerubbabel. And they restored the altar, they rebuilt Jerusalem, they reinstated the morning and the evening sacrifice. Exactly. I mean, and you can go and read it in the book of Ezra explains in detail how all of this took place, how it played out. Now, verse 5. As I was thinking about this, suddenly a goat with a prominent horn between his eyes came from the west. That's interesting. Crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. He comes with speed. Think about it. What is this next kingdom coming? And we know it's a Grecian one because of verse 21 say it's a kingdom of Greece. Well, it was first symbolized as a leopard, fastest moving creature on earth. In other words, what the Bible is telling us, that the kingdom of Alexander the Great and the Grecian Empire, they came with speed. They came very fast. And that was actually the greatest secret of Alexander the Great. His armies had light gear. They could move very fast, very quick. And they overpowered their enemies before they could get ready for battle. His guys were on the guys. And so they had great victories, the Grecian Empire, because they could move so swiftly and so fast. And exactly what the Bible verse says. Suddenly, a goat with a prominent horn. So the goat coming from the west with the prominent horn, we see in verse 21. It's Greece. So if you would look at the world map, and you look at the Mediterranean Sea, and you look at the land of Israel. So from Israel to the east of Israel is what? Iran, which is Persia. Remember, it's only half a generation ago that that the name Persia was changed to Iran. They even speak Farsi, which is Persian, to this day in Iran. That language they speak to this day. To this day, they speak Farsi, which is a Persian language. So what is interesting is that suddenly, coming from the east, reigning the world for a time, there came an army from the western side and overpower this kingdom, which means come from the direction of southern Europe. Greece attacked the Persian Empire without touching the ground. And of course, you can understand, if that animal comes so fast, it means, and it speaks of the armies of Alexander moved with such a speed. And we know from history that there was a great campaign under Alexander, and he attacked the Medes and the Persians, and his army was actually known as a leopard army. Verse 6 and 7 says, and now Daniel continues, he says, in my vision, what I now see is, he came towards this animal, came towards the 2-horned ram, Medo-Persia, and I had seen standing beside the canal, which is, of course, the river, and charged at him in great rage. I saw him attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering the 2 horns. This guy is winning the battle. The ram was powerless, so Medo-Persia was powerless to stand against him. The goat, which is we know now as Greece, knocked him to the ground and trampled on him, and none could rescue the ram from his power. It all played out. What I'm actually reading you is you can go and read in any good library. It's part of history. That's just factual. So the violent clash between these two powers is portrayed here. But this is not the end of the story. So in Daniel's vision, the goat became very great, but at the height of his power, his large horn was broken off. What does that tell you? Alexander the Great came to an end. And in its place, 4 prominent horns grew up towards the 4 winds of heaven. You see, if you love Bible prophecy, if you want to understand Bible prophecy, really you have to give attention to the fine detail in the Bible concerning the wars of these kingdoms. Because remember, these kingdoms and these battles go on until Jesus Christ comes. We are still in the middle of it. You need to understand, we are looking at the battle here, but prophetically, we already moved past this, past that. We are here. We are actually here by the forming of the 10 toes. That, prophetically, in God's word, we have moved and we are there. But looking back, in other words, we are looking back today from there. We're looking back in history and we saw the battle that went on here. Why is it important for us? It's important for us because there's going to come out a word of what has happened here is going to happen again at the end time with a person that had the same character as somebody that lived in these days. There's going to be a double. There's going to be another one that was happened here is going to happen again there, which is, of course, in the future, the very close future, and not far from today, knowing that if the rapture takes place now, these kingdoms have to be fulfilled, as prophecy says. So let's have a look. Alexander died, and 4 other horns appear. What is amazing, history will tell you, like you see in verse 22, as for the broken horn and the 4 that stood up in its place, 4 kingdoms shall rise out of that nation, but not with its power. Somebody else is going to do it. What he's saying is that when the big horn breaks off, here it comes, and the big horn will break off, and when it breaks off, 4 horns. So there goes the horn. What is interesting, look at this. There was this one glorious golden empire of Babylon. When we move to silver, it becomes 2 kingdoms. One is 2 arms. But coming here, it changed from 1 to 4. 1, 2, 4. And at the end, 10. 10 toes. Can you see how the power breaks down? 1 strong kingdom, 2 become 4, 4 eventually become 10. Because the Antichrist will get his power, according to Revelation 17, from all 10 these kings. Can you see how it degrades down? 1, 2, 4, and to 10. And so what we know from history, it's very clear that Cassander ruled over Greece, Lysimachus over Turkey, Seleucus over Syria, and Ptolemy over Egypt. So Babylon, which was a very strong empire, divided into 2. Medes and Persians took over. Then, of course, come Greeks, and Greek was divided, the Grecian Empire, into 4. That's exactly what happened. Now, what is very interesting, of the 4 kingdoms that arose, 2 of them had a very long battle for a very, very long time, according to Daniel chapter 11, called the north and the south. So if you are in the land of Israel, if you are here in Israel, what would be north and what would be south? What would you say? Okay, let's see who of you know your geography. If I'm in the land of Israel, direct north of me, what countries are we looking at? Syria. South, Egypt. Touching south, southwest, Egypt. In other words, what you will find is these 2, Seleucus, which is the north, Syria, and the one that came after him and after him and after him, they always battled with the south. And guess who's between them? Israel. So guess who's going to get the problem all the time? Israel. Okay? Because they're like sandwiched between the two of them. So when we get to, in a few weeks, when we get to Daniel chapter 11, you must remember what we will actually see in Daniel chapter 11 is where it narrows down to a fight between two kingdoms. That's very, very interesting. All right. So we will get to that very soon. So out of this little horn, because we can see what is happening in Daniel chapter 7, which is now very interesting. In Daniel chapter 7, when we had the leopard kingdom, we also heard about a little horn that will appear. And the little horn that will appear, it will be a terrible time because there will be someone that will speak big words, has got big eyes, and speak against the King of heaven. And he will blaspheme, and it will be the Antichrist, as described in the Bible, in the time of the end, in Revelation chapter 13. That is what he will do. But we know historically, if you take me back in history and you say to me, okay, I understand about the future, but tell me about past history. In past history, the little horn that rose and caused so much trouble, who was that historically? Antiochus Epiphanes. It's a man that was a terrible, terrible person, and he was king of the Syrian part of the Grecian Empire, because the Grecian Empire divided into four. And the one that was terrible, the Seleucids, a terrible nation, become part of that Grecian Empire, was the Syrian Empire. Today, we all know who Syria is, and we can see what they are doing to their own people. So Antiochus Epiphanes, he did terrible, terrible things to the people of God. Like, for instance, history will tell us in great detail what he did. Like, for instance, it will tell us that he tried to stop worship of the one true God in the land of Israel. I mean, it's got nothing to do with Israel. He wanted to fight to the south with Egypt. But, you know, one of the things that happened one day, I told you that story. Who of you can remember the story? That when Antiochus Epiphanes, once he was on his horses and all his men, this is a true story from history, and I know the story very, very well. How one of the gentlemen of the Roman Empire was sent. Remember, after the Grecian Empire came the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire sent a message to Antiochus Epiphanes when he was at the border of Egypt and says, the Roman Senate had a meeting and the decision was made, you can't fight with Egypt, please go back home. And Antiochus Epiphanes, when he heard the message, and he's the king of the Seleucids. I mean, he's the king of Syria, and who are they? But he knew Rome, and he knew he doesn't want problems with Rome. And the story is very well known, documented. So the man that brought him the message, he knew personally Antiochus Epiphanes himself. Epiphanes, which means madman, crazy man. That's what he was. That's what Epiphanes means, the madman. So he said to the madman, the Roman Senate has taken a decision, you need to go back. Go back home. I mean, he was a strong one. He could kill this guy, but you know, if he did that, he will have the Romans on him. So he said to the man, he said, I'll think about it. He says, sir, I'll tell you what. He had a stick in his hand, not a spear. And he said, while you're standing there in the sand, in the desert sand, and you draw with a stick a circle in the sand right around him. So, yes, Antiochus Epiphanes in front of all his generals and soldiers, and he stands in the circle. And the man said, before you step out of the circle, sir, Give me your answer to take back to Rome. He was mad about it. And history, when you read what had taken place, of course, he had to succumb under the pressure. And before he stepped out of the circle, he said, okay, I'll go back. But you can just think how much he hated the fact that he has been so proud in front of all his generals and his soldiers, and he's backing down with a man with a stick. He went back to Israel and he ransacked with his soldiers the whole country. He killed thousands and thousands of Jews. He wrecked the temple of God. He desecrated the temple of God. He ordered the abolition of the Sabbath. The ritualistic temple service, he abolished it. If he catch anybody with one of the books of the law, that person was killed instantly. You cannot touch the Old Testament scriptures. No one can praise and worship the God of heaven. You will be murdered if they catch you doing that or even thinking of doing it. He went into the temple. He sacrificed a pig in the Holy of Holies in the Jewish temple. He sprinkled its blood throughout all the temple, desecrated the place of God, and he erected for his own idol, Jupiter, an image in the temple of God. He was so angry what happened to him. He took his men, and he really caused great harm in the land of Israel. But God raised up the Maccabean family, and they defeated the Syrian armies. They were like guerrilla warfare. And so they made a few guerrilla groups. And so they start fighting. And believe it or not, one of his sons, of Judas Maccabee's sons, was called the Hammer. They couldn't kill him. They couldn't catch him. But he nailed Antiochus Epiphanes' armies. So much so that they eventually got all of his armies out of the country of Israel after a long war. And what was amazing is the Maccabees, and I've got some of their writings at home, so sometimes when I read it, I'm just amazed to see how they fight for God. Because they really fight for their country and for their God. And they restored the temple worship, purified, reconsecrated the temple in 165 BC. So 165 years before Jesus Christ came to this earth, the temple was restored. And the sacrifices, the evening and the morning sacrifices, was reinstated. Started again. After this terrible time of what the Grecian Empire of Antiochus Epiphanes has done to the country of Israel. What was amazing is after he heard these things, he heard a voice, a holy one speaking, verse 13 and 14. And another holy one said to him, how long will it take for the vision to be fulfilled? The vision concerning the daily sacrifice, the rebellion that caused desolation, and the surrender of the sanctuary and of the hosts that will be trampled underfoot. And he said to me, it will take 2,300 evenings and mornings. Then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated. What is amazing that in heaven, there was even an alarm in heaven about what this guy did in the country of Israel. It reached heaven. It touched heaven. And from heaven, there was this concern, now that there's no more sacrifices, now that the temple has been desecrated, how long will it take until it is restored again? This was a question in the minds of the heavenly hosts. And the answer of the Holy One was 2,300 evenings and mornings. What it actually indicates, if you go back in history, if we lived at that time, we wouldn't really understand what it meant. But today, it's very easy for us to know what happened. It's very easy from history. Because if you look at the dates, when the desecration of the altar took place in the temple by Antiochus Epiphanes, until the reconsecration of the temple service under Judas the Maccabee, which happened in 165 before Christ, the duration was 2,300 days. Exactly. And if you go back in history, that specific numbering of the days was because the fact that the Jewish sacrifices was prescribed for every day in the morning and in the evening. If you calculate it, you will find exactly from the first time that Antiochus desecrated the temple to stop doing what he did until the day it was reinstated was 2,300 evenings and mornings. Exactly what Bible prophecy says. And this is what the explanation says. And it actually happened historically under Judas the Maccabee. And so in verse 15, while I, Daniel, was watching the vision and trying to understand it, there before me stood one who looked like a man. And I heard the man's voice from the Ulai calling, Gabriel, tell this man the meaning of the vision. And he came near the place where I was standing. I was terrified and fell prostrate. Son of man, he said to me, understand that the vision concerns the time of the end. You see what's happening now? While he was speaking to me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground. Then he touched me and raised me to my feet. He said, I'm going to tell you what will happen in the time of wrath, because the vision concerns the appointed time of the end. So he was told by Gabriel, the angel Gabriel, that there's a reason why this is going to happen. And so his message to him was, the two-horned ram that you saw represent the kings of Media and Persia. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. And the large horn between his eyes is the first king. And he said, Daniel, the four horns that replaced the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. How did the angel know all these things? Who gave him all this information? To tell it to Daniel. That's it. You got it. Because in Daniel chapter 10, 2 chapters onward, one of the angels speaking to Daniel said to him, let me tell you what is written in the book of the wars of the Lord, in a book of truth in heaven. So the angel, he read what is written in God's books of wars that will happen on earth. So can you imagine that God even has a book in heaven concerning the wars between mankind on earth? God has a book, which actually tells us if God has a book about wars with mankind, it means that God's book also account for the angelical wars in the angelical world, because there's fight in the angelical world and then it plays out on the earth, as we see in Daniel chapter 10 and Daniel chapter 11. Very, very true. So what Gabriel does, he identifies the ram as the kings of the Medes and of the Persians. So the ram of the two horns represent these two kingdoms, Medes and Persians. One of the horns, Persia is a dominant, and the one horn that emerged lastly, historically, in the Persian kingdom, as it is followed directly to the kingdom of the Medes. So what we can see here, that the extent of the kingdom of the Medes and the Persians reach in all directions, become very victorious, but then suddenly Greece appears on the scene. And Greece attacks Persia from the southern European homeland, which is west from Persia. And the shaggy ghost came from the west, and Greece lies to the west of Persia. They attacked Persia very swiftly, and of course the guy that did it, or the first king, was Alexander the Great. He died, his four generals took over. And now suddenly everything changes. Verse 23, verse 25, because now you have the prototype of the Antichrist. Listen what he says. In the latter part of their reign, when rebels have become completely wicked, a stern-faced king, a master of intrigue will arise. He will become very strong, but not by his own power. He will cause astounding devastation and will succeed in whatever he does. He will destroy the mighty men and the holy people. He will cause deceit to prosper and will consider himself superior. When they feel secure, he will destroy many and take his stand against the Prince of Princes, even the King of Heaven. Yet he will be destroyed, but not by human power. So when we read here, we realize we're talking about somebody in the Grecian Empire going to do it, but you can already see there is a prophecy, it will transcend. And of course, there's nobody else and nobody other than Antiochus Epiphanes that has done this. But we know when we read Daniel 7 verse 8, Daniel 9, 27, Matthew 24, 15, 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 3 to 10, and Revelation 13 verse 1 to 8. All of these New Testament scriptures, including Daniel 7 verse 8 and 9 verse 27, if you read them all together, you see a firm picture of the coming Antichrist. So what you do find is what Antiochus Epiphanes has done to the temple of God the day when he left Egypt, and the desecration and everything he did there in the land of Israel, the Antichrist will come and do in our day. He will do the same. He will desecrate the temple. He will put up an image of himself. He will declare himself in the temple to be God. So it means Israel will have to build the temple again, because it must be desecrated. According to Daniel 9 verse 27 and according to Revelation chapter 11, there will be a temple, and 2 Thessalonians 2 and Matthew 24 verse 15, there will be a temple in the last days. And that temple will be dedicated to God, and they will bring until the middle of the 7-year tribulation sacrifices Israel, morning and evening sacrifices, and then suddenly the Antichrist will appear. And he will go and sit in the temple, an image will be erected, and he must be worshipped in the temple of God as God. That's what's coming for Israel. When we study again and look carefully at what we've learned, we do notice the following, that the little horn that was yet to appear, his appearance would transpire in the latter part, which we know, when we look back in history, 175 before Christ, of the Grecian Empire, because if we study the verses, when we go back in history, we have the dates. Daniel didn't have the dates. We have it today, looking back in history. He was extraordinarily intelligent, a shrewd diplomat. He deceived and corrupted many. He would attack the south, Egypt, and the east, Persia, and the beautiful land, Palestine, and he will gain great victories. He would specially target the Jews and would do great harm to the holy nation of Israel, even abolish the daily ritual sacrifices in the Jewish temple, and he would rise up against God and prevent the worship of God. All of that is the trademark of the coming Antichrist. Exactly what's going to happen. And he would eventually come to his end, but not by human hands. Even the Antichrist, not by human hands, because Jesus Christ, he will come and will make sure he be thrown into the lake of fire, the Antichrist and the false prophet. Antiochus died from a hideous disease because it was prophesied not by human hands, and his end would come by an intervention from heaven. This brings us, of course, us to the close of chapter 8, verse 26 and verse 27 says, so Daniel, the explanation is, the vision of the evenings and mornings that has been given you is true, but seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. And now Daniel, he speaks, he says, Daniel, I was exhausted and lay ill for several days because of this vision he saw. It drained him. Then I got up and went about the king's business. I was appalled by the vision. It was beyond understanding. It was too much for me. But he heard from the angel Gabriel that the vision that he saw, or what he had seen, would be fulfilled, but after a considerable long time frame. So Daniel, greatly disturbed by all became ill, but he resumed his activities. But the action part comes in Daniel chapter 9. When we come together again, what we will see is Daniel was led by the Holy Spirit to open the scriptures to start reading the Bible. And in the next chapter, as he opened the scriptures, something huge happened. And that I will share with you next week. God bless you. Till next week, we'll speak again.